Settlement Kairos 7 was not the kind of place that appeared in strategic assessments. It was not on any military corridor. It was not adjacent to any resource deposit significant enough to justify a claim dispute. It was not politically important, not commercially significant, not the kind of colony that the Galactic Assembly's Department of Territorial Affairs noted with anything other than the routine acknowledgement it gave to all registered human settlements in the outer expansion zones. It was, by every measure that the Assembly used to determine which places mattered, a place that did not matter. 3,412 people, 42 square kilometers of cultivated land. A processing station, a medical facility, a school with 219 students, a community center that served as everything the colony needed a shared space for, and farmland, mostly grain, some vegetable cultivation, some livestock in the eastern fields that had been worked by the same families for 3 generations. The colony had been established 81 years ago by 11 human families who had looked at an available land grant in the outer zone, calculated that the soil composition was workable, and signed the registration papers. Their descendants were still there. The community had grown the way communities grow when they are left alone, and are doing well enough. Slowly, steadily, with the particular kind of rootedness that develops when the same families have buried their dead in the same ground for 3 generations, and have no intention of being the generation that leaves. The Keth Marauder fleet was not interested in Kairos 7 specifically. This was, in a way, the most frightening thing about what happened, because it meant that what happened to Kairos 7 could have happened to any settlement of similar size and similar isolation in the outer expansion zone, and there were 43 such settlements. The Keth were not a member species of the Galactic Assembly. They were a classification the Assembly used, somewhat imprecisely, to describe a loose affiliation of independent raider groups that operated in the outer zones and that shared, across their various factions, certain operational preferences. They targeted isolated settlements. They moved quickly. They took what was transportable and destroyed what was not, and they avoided engagements with anything that had a credible military response capacity. This last preference was the relevant one. The Keth were not fearless. They were, in the assessment of every intelligence service that had studied them, rational actors whose rationality expressed itself as a preference for targets that could not effectively resist. They had operated in the outer zones for 30 years. In 30 years, they had successfully raided 61 settlements. Of those 61 settlements, 58 had been non-human colonies belonging to species that had, in the aftermath, filed reports with the Assembly and received formal acknowledgement of the violation, and in most cases, nothing else, because the Assembly's enforcement capacity in the outer zones was limited, and the Keth's operational dispersal made coordinated response difficult. 3 of the 61 had been human settlements. All 3 of those raids had been partial. The Keth had engaged, encountered resistance they had not anticipated, and withdrawn before completing their operation. The intelligence files on those 3 incidents were sparse, because the human settlements involved had not filed extensive reports, and because the Assembly's analysts had classified the incomplete raids as anomalies and moved on. They had not asked why all 3 human settlement raids had been incomplete. They had not compared the incomplete raid reports to each other. If they had, they might have noticed a pattern. They did not notice the pattern until Kairos 7, when the pattern became impossible to miss. The Keth faction that targeted Kairos 7 was one of the larger ones, 41 vessels, approximately 600 personnel, commanded by a raider leader named Veth-Korum who had been operating in the outer zones for 18 years, and who had, in those 18 years, successfully completed 23 raids without a single failure. Veth-Korum was not careless. He was experienced and methodical, and his methodology was built on accurate assessment of target resistance capacity, which he conducted through preliminary surveillance before committing to an operation. The preliminary surveillance of Kairos 7 took 4 days and was, by every metric Veth-Korum used, reassuring. The settlement had no military installation, no defensive fortifications, no armed vessels in the local space. The settlement's communication array was civilian-grade, sufficient for internal communication, and for transmitting to the nearest assembly relay but not configured for the kind of long-range encrypted signaling that would indicate a military connection. The population was entirely civilian: farmers, technicians, medical staff, teachers, the ordinary composition of an agricultural settlement that had been established by families and had grown into a community. Veth-Korum assessed the resistance capacity of Kairos 7 as minimal and filed his operational plan. 4 vessels would hold position above the settlement to provide air support if required. 37 would land personnel in 3 waves. The first wave would secure the processing station and the communication array. The second would begin extraction of transportable assets. The third would handle any resistance that emerged. He had used this plan with minor variations 23 times. It had worked 23 times. He had no reason to expect it would not work a 24th. The first wave landed at 3:40 hours, in the pre-dawn dark that Veth-Korum preferred because it reduced the settlement's response time. The first wave's objective, secure the processing station, and the communication array, was achieved within 11 minutes. This was within the expected timeline. The second wave landed at 3:55 hours and began the extraction operation. This was also within the expected timeline. The deviation from the expected timeline began at 4:12 hours, when the second wave's extraction team encountered, at the eastern edge of the processing station, a man named Elias Marsh. Elias Marsh was 63 years old. He had lived on Kairos 7 his entire life, the third generation of the Marsh family, who had been among the 11 original settlers 81 years ago. He farmed the eastern fields, grain primarily, some root vegetables, and the livestock that his grandfather had brought to the colony as breeding stock and that his family had managed for 3 generations. He was not a soldier. He had never been a soldier. He had, as far as the settlement's records showed, no military training of any kind. What he had was a rifle that his father had given him when he was 17, which he used for pest control on the eastern fields, and which he had picked up when he heard the ships land, because he had heard ships land before, and he knew what sound a civilian transport made, and he knew what sound this was not. He had walked from his house to the processing station in the dark, not running, because running in the dark on familiar ground when you are carrying a loaded rifle is how you fall, and he had positioned himself at the eastern edge of the station building, and he had watched the second wave's extraction team for approximately 4 minutes before the extraction team's lead noticed him. The lead raised his weapon. Elias Marsh did not move. He said, in standard Galactic, which he spoke with the flat accent of someone who had learned it from a textbook rather than from conversation, "You should leave." The extraction team's lead did not leave. He transmitted a report to Veth-Korum indicating that a single armed civilian had been encountered at the processing station's eastern edge and was not complying with the operation's presence. Veth-Korum's response was to send 2 additional personnel from the third wave to handle the situation, because 1 armed civilian was not a situation that required more than 3 personnel to resolve. The 2 additional personnel arrived at the eastern edge of the processing station at 4:19 hours. By 4:19 hours, Elias Marsh was no longer alone. He had been joined by a woman named Sarah Tanaka Marsh, who was his daughter-in-law, who was 38 years old, who managed the grain processing operation, and who had been sleeping in the processing station's overnight office when the ships landed, and had been awake and watching through the station's internal cameras since 3:42 hours. She had a shotgun that she used for the same purpose Elias used his rifle, and for the same reason he had picked his up, and she was standing 3 meters to his left. Behind them, at the station's main entrance, there were 2 more people. A man named Jonas Wren, who was 44 and operated the colony's equipment maintenance depot, and who had a hunting rifle, and had walked 20 minutes across the settlement to be there. And a woman named Dr. Priya Anand, who was 51, who was the colony's senior medical officer, and who was not armed but who had brought a medical kit, and who had positioned herself behind the two armed people with the specific practicality of someone who has decided that the most useful thing she can do is be ready for whatever comes next. The Keth personnel at the eastern edge of the processing station looked at these four people. They transmitted another report to Veth-Korum. Veth-Korum reviewed the report and authorized deployment of the third wave's full complement to the processing station to conclude the situation. The third wave's full complement was 40 personnel. By the time the third wave's full complement reached the processing station at 43 hours, there were 19 people standing in and around it. They had arrived in ones and twos over the preceding 12 minutes, from different directions, from different parts of the settlement, without coordination in the sense of a command structure or a plan. There was no command structure, and there had been no plan. What there had been was the settlement's emergency notification system, which was a civilian system, a network of personal communicators that every adult in Kairos 7 carried, that had been established when the colony was founded because the outer zone's isolation made emergency communication a practical necessity, and that Sira Tanaka Marsh had activated at 4:07 hours with a message that said, in plain language, without military terminology or formal protocol: ships landed, not ours, processing station, come if you can. 19 people had come. They ranged in age from 22 to 71. They had between them 6 rifles, 3 shotguns, 2 hunting bows which were not primarily weapons but which were what 2 people had, 1 industrial cutting torch carried by a woman named Anna Reyes who operated the colony's fabrication shop and who had thought practically about what she had that could serve as a deterrent, and 7 people who had come with no weapon at all but who had come. The 40 Keth personnel of the third wave stopped at the edge of the processing station's open ground and looked at the 19 people in front of them and transmitted a third report to Veth-Korum. Veth-Korum, who had been conducting successful raids for 18 years, reviewed the third report and experienced something he did not have a name for but that functioned in his decision-making the way a warning signal functions, not as information about what he was facing exactly, but as information that what he was facing was not what he had assessed it to be. What Veth-Korum was facing, and what his preliminary surveillance had not captured because his assessment framework had no metric for it, was not a military unit. It was not a militia in the formal sense. It was 19 people who lived in the same place and had decided, each of them separately and then together, that the place was worth standing in front of. Elias Marsh was standing in the front because he had arrived first, and he was the oldest person present, and in the community of Kairos 7, those two things combined produced a kind of informal authority that was not rank but was recognized. He had not told anyone to come. He had not organized a defense. He had walked to the processing station with his rifle because it was his settlement and there were ships that were not supposed to be there, and 19 other people had made the same calculation independently and arrived at the same place. The Keth's operational doctrine had a category for civilian resistance. The category was minimal, disorganized, and resolvable through sufficient show of force. The doctrine assumed that civilians, when faced with 40 armed and trained personnel, would calculate their odds and choose self-preservation over resistance. This assumption was built on 61 raids. It was built on experience. It was wrong about Kairos 7, and what Veth-Korum's third report review told him, in the specific way that 18 years of operational experience processes information even when it cannot articulate it clearly, was that it was wrong in a way that his doctrine did not have a response to. He could send his 40 personnel forward. The 19 people in front of the processing station would not retreat. He was certain of this in the way you are certain of something you cannot explain, but cannot dismiss. If he sent his personnel forward, there would be a fight. The fight would produce casualties on his side and on theirs. His side would win the fight. He was also certain of this. But he was in the outer zone with 41 vessels and 600 personnel, and he was looking at a settlement of 3,412 people. And he understood, in the calculating part of his mind that had kept him operational for 18 years, that winning the fight at the processing station was not the same thing as completing the operation. 19 people had arrived in 12 minutes. He did not know how many more were awake and moving. He did not know, and could not have known, about the eastern fields. While the Keth's third wave was deploying toward the processing station, while Veth-Korum was reviewing reports and calculating, the eastern side of Kairos 7 had been doing something that no sensor was tracking and no report was capturing. The Marsh family's farm occupied the eastern edge of the settlement's cultivated land, and the Marsh family was large: Elia's son, daughter-in-law Sarah, 3 grandchildren, and 2 families who had worked the Marsh fields as partners for 20 years, and who ate dinner at the Marsh table on Sundays, and whose children had grown alongside the Marsh grandchildren. When Sarah's emergency notification went out at 4:07 hours, the eastern fields received it the way the rest of the settlement did. But the eastern fields also had something the rest of the settlement did not. The Marsh family's equipment barn, which contained, in addition to the planting and harvesting machinery that 81 years of agricultural operation had accumulated, 4 ground vehicles rated for rough terrain, a fuel reserve sufficient to run those vehicles for 70 hours, a medical supply cache that the family had maintained since the colony's founding years, because the eastern fields were far from the medical facility and distance made preparation a virtue, and a communication relay booster that Elia's father had installed 30 years ago to ensure the eastern fields stayed connected to the settlement's network regardless of atmospheric interference. It also contained, in a locked storage unit whose combination Elias had given to his son on his son's 18th birthday, and his son had given to his children on their 18th birthdays, a collection of equipment that the Marsh family had never described to the settlement's administration in any formal document, because the settlement's administration had never asked, and because the outer zone's isolation had, 81 years ago, produced in the colony's founders a practical understanding that, in a place where help was far away, the only thing worse than needing something was not having it. The equipment was not military surplus. It had no military serial numbers. It was the kind of thing that people who live far from help and who have thought carefully about what could happen acquire over generations, because they have thought carefully about what could happen. Elia's son, whose name was Thomas Marsh, and who was 41 years old and who had been working the eastern fields since he was 8, was not at the processing station when his wife's notification went out. He was in the equipment barn, because he had heard the ships at 3:40 hours and had made his own assessment, and his assessment had produced a different response than his father's. His father had gone to the processing station because that was where the threat was visible. Thomas had gone to the equipment barn because he had been thinking about what the threat would do if the processing station response was insufficient, and he had decided that the answer to that question was more important than being at the processing station. He was not alone in the barn. His eldest daughter, who was 19 and had been home from the Outer Zone's agricultural college for the summer, was with him, and 2 of the field partner family's adults, and a man named Rel Akafer who was 67 years old and had been farming the eastern fields as Elia's partner for 30 years, and who had a quality of stillness in difficult situations that Thomas had spent his life respecting. They were not talking much. They were listening to the communication channel. They were waiting. Thomas had told them what he thought might happen and what he thought they should do if it happened, and they had listened and agreed, and now they were waiting to find out if he was right. He was right. The notification from the settlement's community center came at 4:38 hours. A woman named Administrator Yori Patel, who ran the community center and who had been awake and monitoring the situation since 3:41 hours, transmitted on the emergency channel that the Keth personnel at the processing station were not withdrawing and that the situation was not resolved. Thomas Marsh looked at the people in the equipment barn. He said, "Let's go." They went. Veth-Korum received a sensor report at 4:41 hours indicating vehicle movement on the settlement's eastern perimeter. He had 4 vessels in position above the settlement. He directed one of them to reposition for a better sensor read on the eastern movement. The repositioned vessel's report came back in 3 minutes. It described 4 ground vehicles moving from the eastern fields toward the settlement's central area, toward the processing station, at standard terrain speed. Vehicles were farm transports, identifiable by their configuration. They were not military vehicles. Veth-Korum's sensor operator noted that the vehicles appeared to be carrying personnel and equipment, and that the equipment's sensor signature was not consistent with agricultural machinery, and that he could not identify the equipment more specifically because its configuration was not in his system's recognition database. Veth-Korum looked at the report. He looked at his operational status. He had 40 personnel at the edge of the processing station's open ground, facing 19 settlers who had not moved. He had 600 total personnel distributed across 41 vessels. He had a settlement of 3,412 people, of whom an unknown knew. Ember were awake and moving. He had an unidentified equipment signature approaching from the east. He had 18 years of experience that had produced 23 successful operations, and he had, for the first time in those 18 years, the specific operational feeling of a situation that was not resolving in the direction his plan required. He had not lost anyone. He had not been fired on. The 19 people at the processing station had not moved. Nothing had happened yet. He was calculating what would happen if he continued the operation, and the calculation was not producing the result it was supposed to produce, because the variable he was trying to solve for, the point at which the settlement's resistance would exhaust itself and the operation could complete, did not appear to have a value. Every resistance he had encountered in 23 previous operations had had a value. At some level of force, the resistance stopped. He looked at Kairos 7 and could not find the level. He withdrew at 4:51 hours, not because he had been defeated, not because anyone had fired on him, or because he had taken casualties, or because a military response had arrived. He withdrew because 18 years of operational experience had given him, as its most valuable product, the ability to recognize when a situation was going to cost more than it was worth, and the calculation had come out wrong. He transmitted the withdrawal order to all 41 vessels, and he filed later an operational report that described the Kairos 7 engagement as an unsuccessful approach due to unexpectedly high resistance capacity. The report was factually accurate in every detail it included and entirely silent on the detail that mattered most, which was that the resistance capacity had not been high in any measurable military sense. 19 people with agricultural rifles and a hunting bow and 1 industrial cutting torch, but had been, in the specific way that mattered to his calculation, unlimited. He did not have a term for this in his reporting framework. He wrote unexpectedly high and filed the report and moved his fleet to the next point on his operational schedule, which was a Chethani agricultural station 3 systems away, which his preliminary surveillance had assessed as minimal resistance, which it was, and which he raided successfully in 4 hours, which was normal, and which felt, in a way he did not discuss with anyone, wrong in the way that things feel wrong when you have just been somewhere that recalibrated your sense of what normal means. The 19 people at the processing station did not know the fleet was withdrawing until Administrator Patel's monitoring equipment confirmed that the Keth vessels were moving away from Kairos 7's orbital position. The confirmation came at 5:08 hours. Patel transmitted it on the emergency channel without comment. Elias Marsh received it standing in front of the processing station in the early light that had come up while they were waiting. He was still holding his rifle. He lowered it. Beside him, Sira Tanakamarsh let out a breath that she had been holding, or had felt like holding, for the past hour. Jonas Wren sat down on the ground because his knees, which had been giving him trouble for 2 years, had decided that the adrenaline of the past 90 minutes was over and were now presenting their invoice. Dr. Priya Anand opened her medical kit and began a systematic check of everyone present, starting with Jonas's knees because that was what you did when the immediate situation was over, you checked. Thomas Marsh's vehicles arrived from the eastern fields at 5:14 hours. Thomas got out and looked at his father. Elias looked at his son. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Elias said, "I thought you were coming sooner." Thomas said, "I was waiting to see if you needed me." Elias said, "I didn't need you." Thomas said, "I know, that's why I waited." They stood together for a while in the early light, and the eastern fields were behind them, and the processing station was in front of them, and the settlement of Kairos 7 was around them. 3,412 people waking up to a morning that was the same as every other morning in its fields and its light and its soil, and different from every other morning in the specific way of mornings that come after a night when you were not certain they would. The settlement filed a report with the Galactic Assembly's Department of Territorial Affairs at 900 hours that same morning. The report was filed by Administrator Yori Patel, who had been writing it since 600 hours and who had a background in administrative documentation that showed in the report's structure. It was complete, chronological, factually precise, and entirely without embellishment. It described the Keth fleet's arrival, the occupation of the processing station, the emergency notification, the assembly of settlers at the station, the fleet's withdrawal, and the estimated timeline of each event. It attached, as supporting documentation, the communication logs from the emergency notification system and the sensor records from the settlement's monitoring array. It did not describe Elias Marsh's conversation with the Keth extraction team leader. It did not describe Thomas Marsh's equipment barn or its contents. It did not describe what the 4 vehicles from the eastern fields had been carrying when they arrived at the processing station, because by the time they arrived the fleet had already begun withdrawing, and the vehicles had stopped and turned around and gone back to the barn. The report described accurately what had happened and omitted, accurately, what had not needed to happen. The Department of Territorial Affairs received the report and logged it and flagged it for the standard follow-up assessment and sent an automated acknowledgement to Administrator Patel. The acknowledgement said, "Your report has been received and will be reviewed within the standard processing window of 60 days. Patel read the acknowledgement and filed it. She did not respond to it. She had a settlement to administer and the grain harvest was in 3 weeks, and the processing station's extraction records had been disrupted during the occupation and needed to be reconstructed before the harvest began. She had work to do. She did it." The Department of Military Affairs classification review that followed the Kairos 7 incident was not the first time humanity's classification had been examined, but it was the first time the examination included a field report from a civilian settlement that had produced a successful deterrent outcome without any military personnel, any formal defense structure, or any weapons beyond what a farming community in the outer zone considered ordinary equipment. The analyst assigned to review the incident was a young Thuresi named Veth-Korum who had been in the department for 4 years, and who had, in those 4 years, developed the habit of asking questions that senior analysts had stopped asking because experience had convinced them the answers were already known. The question Veth-Korum asked, reading the Kairos 7 report, was, "Why did the Keth withdraw?" The report described what happened. It did not explain why the fleet commander, who had 41 vessels and 600 personnel facing 19 settlers with agricultural rifles, had made the calculation he made. Veth-Korum filed a supplementary research request. The request asked for the operational reports from the 3 previous incomplete Keth raids on human settlements. The reports were retrieved from the archive. Veth-Korum read all 3. Then he read the Kairos 7 report again. Then he wrote a 4-page internal memo that he addressed to the department's senior analyst, and that began with a question. What does a raider calculate when the resistance doesn't have a ceiling? The memo was read. It was discussed. It did not resolve the question, because the question did not have a clean answer, but it produced a research project that ran for 2 years and that eventually contributed, among other things, to the revised strategic framework for outer zone settlement security that the Assembly adopted 8 years later, which included, for the first time, a formal recognition that civilian settlement communities in the outer zones had demonstrated conflict deterrent capacity that did not fit existing military classification frameworks, and that required a distinct assessment approach. The framework did not name Kairos 7. It did not name Elias Marsh. It contained, in its second paragraph, a sentence that Veth-Korum had drafted and that the senior analyst had kept without revision. The deterrent capacity of an isolated human settlement cannot be reliably assessed from its military resources alone, because the relevant resource is not primarily military. The relevant resource is the decision. Elias Marsh retired from farming the eastern fields 6 years after the night the Keth fleet came and went. His son Thomas took over the operation. His grandchildren, who had been in bed when it happened, and had learned about it the next morning in the matter-of-fact way that children learn about things their parents have decided they are old enough to know, grew up in a settlement that talked about that night the way communities talk about the things that revealed something about them. Not as a military victory, because it had not been a military engagement. Not as a heroic event, because the people who had stood at the processing station did not describe it in heroic terms when they talked about it, which was not often. They talked about it mostly in the context of other things, in conversations about the settlement's history, or the outer zone's particular conditions, or the question that every isolated community eventually discusses, which is, what do you do when you are far from help and something happens? The answer that Kairos 7 had arrived at, before the question was formally asked, was the answer that emerged from 3 generations of the Marsh family farming the eastern fields, and Jonas Wren maintaining the equipment depot, and Sira Tanaka Marsh running the processing station, and Dr. Priya Anand keeping the medical kit current, and Administrator Patel documenting everything carefully, and 219 children going to school in a building that looked like every other school building in every other outer zone settlement, and that was, like every other thing in Kairos 7, exactly what it appeared to be, and also, in the specific way of things tended carefully over generations, something more than it appeared to be. The Keth raider Veth-Korum had looked at Kairos 7 and seen a settlement with no military protection. He had been correct. He had also been looking at the wrong thing. The protection was not military. It was the same thing the protection had always been, in every human community that had ever been far from help and had decided, quietly and practically and without ceremony, that far from help was not the same as alone. It was the people. It was simply the people, knowing their ground, knowing each other, and deciding together, without orders, without rank, without anything except the knowledge of what the place was worth, that they were enough. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, share it with a fellow HFY fan, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss an upload. Your support keeps these stories coming.